I said Love and Rockets was two guys, the Hernandez brothers, and they had these incredibly endearing characters, Hopi and Maggie, and then they also had this little barrio in Mexico, Luba, and it was just, the stories were fabulous, and it drew me in to just reading kind of, I guess I had never really read comics before, so it was a way to get into comics without jumping right into superheroes. And then I was working at Marvel Comics, and Walt Simonson's Thor was the very first comic where I was like, another page? Is there going to be another page soon, I hope? You know, where you're just waiting for the next issue. So, your gateway drug? Marijuana? Or?
For me, it was the Spider-Man cartoon from the '67. Oh. It was in rotation when I was after school, so I just loved Spider-Man. And then Spider-Man came to my hometown to a 7-Eleven to sign comics, and I had to buy comics so he could sign them. So I was reading Amazing, Marvel Team Up, Detective, Brave and Bold, like anything with Spider-Man or Batman, because those are the guys I knew. But then it's like your gateway, and then you start reading comics, and then I was in high school, and Bill Sienkiewicz and Doug Mensch were doing Moon Knight. And oh my God, I had to own every single comic that ever had Moon Knight in it. If he was in Contest of Champions in one little panel, I had to have it because Moon Knight was in it.
How did Spider-Man get to the 7-Eleven? Did he like drive?
No. This is what any kids? Any kids here? No. This is what fucked me up for life.
Do you smell like whiskey?
No. They
sit on my lap, Dan.
There's a kid.
No, I wanted to. I wanted to see
behind the 7-Eleven.
I wanted to see Spider-Man show up. So I got there early, and I rode on my bike to our local 7-Eleven. I got out, and I sat on the sidewalk, and I was just looking at the sky, and I was waiting for Spider-Man to come swinging in. And then I got really nervous because it was in suburban California and there were no tall buildings. Right. And I didn't know how Spider-Man was going to get there. And there was an overpass. And this is like Carter years and gas lines and all these, you could see all these cars all up on the overpass waiting. And this red pickup, people were letting it through, and it was weaving in and out. And if you can imagine two guys in the 70s and one had access to a Spider-Man costume, he's standing in the bed of the pickup, arms akimbo. And everyone in the 70s is like, yeah, Spider-Man! And I'm just like watching this in awe. And of course, that's how Spider-Man would come to Stockton, California, in the bed of a pickup. And the thing drove down, and I saw it. And I was the only one waiting for Spider-Man to get to 7-Eleven. And when it drove up to the front, I'm just sitting there in awe and wonder. He jumped out of the back of the pickup. He landed in a crouch. Mm-hmm. He totally played for me. And then he got up, and then he just walked in like it was every day.
You know what? Honestly, I'm very glad I asked.
Yeah, Brevoort makes me tell that story every time that they made me write it up in the back of the letter column in the 50th anniversary. But that's what screwed me for life. All those comics are gone. The two that he signed, because I reread them so many times, they just fell apart. Mm-hmm. That was my gateway.
That's funny. I don't remember a time when I was not reading comics, actually. So when I was a kid, I read what is early to nowadays, Adventures of Batman. And this was like the late 50s, early 60s. Some of which weren't very good, some of which were really terrific. And I always liked. I developed an intense liking for Batman from that point, which is maintained to this day. As to what you should read, I would recommend. I'm not real familiar with a lot of the stuff that's being published today. I would suggest, depending on what you like, if you like superheroes, if you don't like whatever, start off with some of the I would say the run on for the best superhero comic of all time is, say, Lee and Kirby's Fantastic Four from, like, say, 1963 through 64. It was like a whole year. It was like 18 months of cliffhangers. Something happened every issue. Every issue introduced a key concept to the Marvel Universe. The Inhumans, Galactus, any of those characters. So those were great stuff. And thankfully, they're all still they're readily available thanks to the masterworks and the reprints. The Lee Ditko Spider-Man, you ought to know, because that's the foundation of the character that they're still building on to this day. And you ought to know the work of Will Eisner also, because he's not contemporary, but he's a wonderful storyteller and invented a lot of the storytelling devices that we use in comics.
Modern day, you of course Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the first comic I ever bought was I don't even know the number. It was an Amazing Spider-Man, and Captain America and Spider-Man were fighting on the cover. No. And, as a kid, I'm like, these guys are good guys. Why are they fighting each other? So I had picked that up, and I read it, and then I made my mom take me to a comic book store. And then what I originally fell in love with was Chris Claremont X-Men run. And that's really what got me sort of into collecting and hardcore. And then I went to college, and when I came out of college, I had discovered Concrete. And Concrete, Think Like a Mountain, totally changed my whole impression of what comics could be as a medium, and that's what, more than anything else, made me want to write comics. So I've been a fan of wrestling my whole life, and then I decided to write a comic book about wrestling, sort of examining the craft of wrestling because, that's, I guess, what I know.
So the first comic I ever got was, I have 3 brothers and sisters, and we're actually driving down to Florida. We grew up in Michigan, so we're on a long drive down, and my mom and dad, they had 4 young kids in the backseat of the station wagon, and they were, it was a bad scene, as you could imagine. So my dad sort of pulled over to get gas, and he goes in and he comes out with comic books, and the first comic book I ever got was an issue of Fantastic Four. I'm pretty sure it was maybe 163. It was like on trial with the Asgardians. I don't know if you know what I mean. Anyway, so I read it, but the story didn't finish. On that page 20, it's like, what? This is, my little 7-year-old mind or whatever is like, this is bullshit. I mean, this is, when you read a book, it's supposed to be finished. And so then, I never got the second part because we were driving to Florida, and at that time it was spinner racks, and it was very hard to get the next thing. But then on that trip down there, I think it couldn't have been contemporary with this, but it was another trip down to Florida. We used to come down to, Sanibel Island a lot and stay there for over Christmas sometimes. And so at the spinner racks in the grocery stores, I found Secret Wars 2, number 4. And Secret Wars 2 is not known today as being a phenomenally creatively successful event. But
it was awesome. Don't listen to him.
I mean, I loved it. I loved it.
Together and fought. It was what he was talking about with Captain America and Spider-Man times a million.
Yeah, it was sweet. No, I wouldn't say that. But at the time it was, particularly because it introduced me to the idea of so I found part 4 and really thought it so there were part 3 and parts, 6 through 9 or whatever. It was a 12 issue, but it hadn't finished by then, at various grocery stores all around the island. So I was dragging my parents to all the different spinner racks to find the other parts because at that point they didn't re-rack or anything. They just sort of stuffed things in this mishmash. So I finally found some of it, most of it, and it was really something. The Beyonder and Spider-Man teaching him how to use the bathroom. Yeah, it was really.
Wait, one of your gateways was Secret Wars 2. Oh my
yeah,
God,
that's what I'm saying. Secret Wars 2.
You must really love comics.
That's made me what I am today. Secret Wars 2.
Oh my God.
So, yeah, and then you sort of drop in and out. At least I did. A lot of people drop in and out of comics as they grow up, and so I had those early ones, and then kind of dropped out. Back in college, I got into sort of the Frank Miller, Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen. Sandman was a big deal for me. The Clone Saga, which is really how you do Spider-Man, Dan.
I'm sorry. I'm still blown away by Secret Wars 2. That's like someone saying, the Star Wars prequels really got me into Star Wars. Mm-hmm. It's like that level of crap.
Yeah. So
God bless you.
I persevered. Whatever. So anyway, so that's how it worked for me. But basically, I think the thing to take away from it, and I'm sure you'll say the same thing, is that there's a billion. Comics is gigantic. So it's really about whatever spurs your taste. But anyway.
Charles, that's a blast from the past. In my neighborhood where I grew up, there was no way to find comics. You couldn't buy comics. Even the 7-Eleven didn't have comics, and people used to trade comics you get from people. And my gateway drug, believe it or not, was the Harvey Caspers and Richie Rich. And I think I learned to reading like Richie Rich and Casper. And sadly, those are not available to kids per se now. But it wasn't until my mom said, "Oh, you can subscribe to comics," and I subscribed to a man called Nova. Oh. And I started getting Nova in the mail, and this is before I knew that people collected comics, and the comic would come all beat up, and roughed up. But one time, Marvel sent a little personal message to me, and that made it. That made it for me. Just said, "Thanks for subscribing to Nova."
When I was working at Marvel on staff, I used to do art returns for about a year or so, and we would get I would have to split up the art between the pencilers and the inkers and get it back to them. And I would hit the page where it was the letters page, where it was all just, we couldn't reuse it. We couldn't peel off the letters and slap new stuff. So it was just going to get thrown out. And I went to Mark Grunwald, and I said, can we do something with this? We're just going to toss it. And Mark looked at it and goes, why don't we send these to like one of the people who gave us the address? And Marvel started doing that. And for years we heard, I got the letters page that I had my letters on. But nowadays it's all digital. But we did that for a good couple of years.
This was handwritten. So I don't know. I wish I still had it. I was like, whoa.
I'll get to
Maybe
like,
you wrote it.
No, like Tom Brevoort and me and other guys, we run into people at like celebrities at shows where they still remember getting the No Prize, the physical No Prize. And Russell T Davies is so happy because he has a No Prize. Like people have.
But there actually is a No Prize, right?
Yeah.
There's a real.
It's an envelope with nothing inside.
No, it
But
is not.
no.
It's got lots
I've
of
sent
prizes.
but the No Prize is an envelope saying
Yes,
you've won a No
but
Prize
at least it said-
with nothing
at least you
inside.
get either Hulk, Spider-Man, or there was a character
On
that
it
said,
saying-
here's your No Prize.
And there's nothing
then
inside. But George R.R. Martin used to write to Marvel Comics. You can read his letters in the letter columns.
It was very persnickety, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Like the couple, like very, like, hey guys.
Why did this character do this in this panel? He's never done this before, George R.R. Martin.
Yeah. Now look what he has. Now karma has come back because he gets that all the time from his own fans. So,
Should we make up another question?
yeah, let's make another question. Well, there we go. All right.
I wasn't sure if you guys were doing questions. Yeah.
I don't know what we're doing. How about this little
No,
guy?
he started.
You're second.
Yeah,
You're
you're
second.
second. You can go first.
You go. Yeah, he goes second.
I really wanted to ask you guys.
And you were to send it to the Comics Code Authority, and they wouldn't approve it. You still publish it?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
I actually had to do that as an editor. I had a comic that my editor, Ralph Macchio, wasn't in the office for a couple days, and I had to deal with the comics code because I had just sent a comic out. And I just assumed they were going to say yes because the comic was so late. It had to go straight to the printer. And then this thing showed up from the Comics Code Authority. It was an issue of Doctor Strange, a 5-page backup about the history of werewolves. And there was one shot where a werewolf woman was wearing Daisy Duke jeans, was straddling a man she just killed, banged to the moon, and her shirt had popped open, and you could see her furry werewolf boobies. And the code had circled her crotch and each boob with a red marker and said, you have to pull this back and you have to fix this. And this had already gone to the printers. If I brought it back, the book would miss shipping and I'd get in trouble and everyone would get in trouble. So I was arguing with the man with the comics code, going, I can't do it. You have to do it. And, he's like, ugh. And then finally I said, look, she's wearing pants. Nothing bad can be happening. She's wearing pants. He's like, fine, you still have to fix the boobies. So I just said, okay, imagine they sent it back. We're going to bring it back. I'll take it to the art department. Imagine we shaved off all the fur, put her in a Lycra bodysuit, dipped her in glue, and rolled her back in the fur. Would that be okay? And the guy went, yeah. They went, imagine we did that. And there's a long pause, and he goes, okay, it's okay.
Should we explain what the CCA was? Because I've never had to write an issue that was subject to it, but I think some of the folks here have
Well, I
probably.
think one of the things we figured out was that we could just not put the sticker on the front. You know, it was sort of it wasn't not a completely official authority. I think probably you know more about this. But yeah, we used to get the Xeroxes. You'd get these Xeroxes with a bunch of things circled that they thought was wrong, and then you'd call and you'd fight them for each little point. And then sometimes you just print it anyway. It's not like they were going to come down to the office and spank you.
I like that idea.
This came about because of like McCarthy era stuff.
It was Werther, right? Werther. Yeah. So there was a man who was I believe he was a congressman or was he?
No.
Wordsman was the psychologist.
Psychologist.
Okay, yeah. Who basically he felt that comics were corrupting the youth. So there were a lot of congressional hearings and so on, I believe, about it, and out of that came the Comics Code Authority, which someone who knows more can.
Well,
You might know some stuff.
Maybe, yeah. You want me to? The thing about the Comic Code Authority is, yeah, there are a lot of instances. Anybody who was working in comics at that time can probably tell you instances where the code sort of violated its own authority, or even went too far in some of its strictures. But I have sometimes taken, like right now, I guess, the sometimes unpopular opinion that while the comic code was itself very, very imperfect, there did need to be some kind of governing body that does look at what children read and say, well, this is okay and this is not. This came out of about a famous EC story of the 50s called, I mean, my belief in this came out of an EC story in the 50s which any kid could buy called Foul Play, which was basically boiled down to, the concept is, it's a baseball game played on a baseball diamond made of human entrails. Yeah.
No heads?
And the heads might have been the balls. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So without wanting to come down on the side of censorship, I think someone, maybe an outside party, needs to take a look at something and say, wait a minute, this maybe shouldn't be done. We're sort of so close to the work sometimes, and so in love with our own creativity that sometimes we think, that this will, you can put things in the stories that maybe should not be put in stories, which frankly, let's face it, many of them are still read by children.
Yeah.
Well, if you disagree, if you disagree, go ahead.
I mean, I also think that no matter what, they are comic books. So, you can. I have a whole range of opinions on this that I won't bore you with. And at the time, Worthman, they dug up all these EC comics, right? And they had here's a page of a guy who chainsaws his wife apart and then stuffs her down the toilet, so he did parade out. But then the same thing happened with video games. Sure. So it's an ongoing argument about, censorship versus free speech.
Well, there's also some wonderful comics that came about because how people had to write around the code became some of the most creative comics you'll ever read. The Fleischer Aparo run on the Spectre, almost every issue goes right up to the comics code and comes a way to deke around it. So you get, you're not allowed to chop a person up with a chainsaw. Well, the Spectre turns him into a wooden living statue, and then he chops him up. So all these things, and it would just constantly vex the code, and it almost felt like that was the entire point of that run of comics. It was wonderful. Wrath of the Spectre, Aparo and Fleischer, brilliant comics.
And you had the same thing going on in movies. You had the Hollywood Code. So the Hollywood Code printed up this code, the Hays Code, and it was like, a couple could sit on a bed, but one person had to keep a foot on the floor, and there's this famous Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy movie where they've clearly probably spent the night together, but they cut away, and then the next day he comes into the office to see her, and she hands him his hat and said, "Here's your hat, what's your hurry?" And it was their way of saying, he left his hat there the night before.
But it becomes more elegant because of the way it's handled,
elegant. It's basically finding ways to get around, but go ahead.
There's a thing where Selznick used to have fights with Hitchcock, and they had movies come out around the same time where they each had where the Selznick movie, there's so long you could sustain a kiss. You could only have a kiss go so long in a movie. And they both had the same scene in their movies come out like on the same month. And the Selznick one only keeps it for the Hays appropriate. And the Hitchcock one keeps jump cutting to fireworks and cutting back to the kiss.
So I feel like we lost the young man who actually asked the CCA question. So maybe we can move on to something else.
Well, I just have one more thing to say about the comic code, which is there was when I was an editor at DC, they were always very adamant about having the code seal on the cover. I did it was the first Batman the Outsiders annual, had a very strong cover motif, and I wanted to basically keep the eye focused on that, so I took off what I deemed to be any extraneous bit of copy, which included creator credits and that type of thing. And I said to Bob Razakis, who was in the production department at DC at the time, was our contact with the comic code. I said, "Can we take off the code seal?" And he said, "No, absolutely not. Can't possibly do that." And I said, "Okay, can we use the code seal but take off the little postage stamp border around it?" And he said, "Yeah, you can do that." So that's how we did it. But a lot of these guys, I'm sorry, one more thing. A lot of these guys, I keep saying me and Peter Falk, yeah. A lot of these guys, like, say, Joe Orlando, who was an editor at DC and also an artist on the ECs in the 50s, were very adamant about maintaining the code and because you have to realize a lot of these guys they felt threatened by the code. They were a lot of people considered them child pornographers because they were in comics at the time and considered them one step up or maybe one step below pornographers. So they were you had to take his possibly what I deemed to be overreactions as a young punk into consideration, the fact that when he was a young punk, his job was threatened, and they had no idea if he was going to be able to get another one.
You can actually read interviews and things where Stan Lee and Wortham used to go on circuits at colleges and debate each other in front of audiences. It's really cool.
I know that you've been waiting
Yeah.
question number 2.
I wanted to go into editorial kind of questions.
Sure.
You guys both come from different companies. How involved in your storytelling are the editors? Do they pitch you ideas and then you riff off them? Do you pitch them and then they say no or yay? And how much do you use them as kind of like your muse?
Should we just take turns for that?
Yeah, why don't we do that?
The guys that don't get
Yeah,
to talk
absolutely.
yet. We're talking.
No problem. Editorial work is, when you're independent and you're doing everything yourself, it's a difficult thing, but you definitely have to have somebody looking over your shoulder and reading what you do. Otherwise, you just make mistakes. Even the best writer will make mistakes. So there's collaborations all along the way, whether you're a writer, artist, or I'm just a writer. I wish I was an artist, but you get a collaboration. You have to have someone look at it before you go into production. Thankfully, my letterer is pretty great reader, and he really edits my books for me.
I'm kind of in the same boat as Terry. I do a self-published creator-owned book. I do have people look at it, but for the most part, I kind of function as my own editor. So, I don't have a whole lot to contribute to that.
I think the relationship, every editor is different. They're all different people, and it's not a one shoe fits all job. So some people are more focused on, frankly, I think that editing really has two sides to it. One is making sure that all of the work is in on time, the production side of it is handled properly, and the books are hitting the shelves when they're supposed to hit the shelves. The other side of it is story editing, which is a totally different set of skills, and not everybody has both, and I think some editors gravitate towards one or the other. But your question was mostly about story editing. I feel like what tends to happen is editors, there's a lot of discussion about the direction of a book at the beginning, and then once kind of everything, all the cars are on the track and everything's sort of moving forward, it's more removed. At least that's how it's been with me. Like the detail work is pretty much up to me. I'm usually turning in outlines, but even like Swamp Thing, I'm not really turning in outlines anymore. Or towards the end, I was just sort of turning in issues because with the team was working so well, it wasn't necessarily a thing. And I think that's, if you trust your editor and it develops, then it's not as big a deal. But some editors are more hands-on, so that's what I have.
Well, that's what I want to ask you, Charles. Do you find you work for the Vertigo line, of course, which is considered to be the more mature line sometimes at DC, but you also work on Swamp Thing, which is a company-owned character.
Yeah.
So do they ever give you any strictures about Swamp Thing? Don't do this, don't do that, because you don't own him.
Right.
So,
as far as sort of more grown-up things and things like that, kind of just like we were talking about, or whatever it might be.
Anything.
Not as much. The only real notes that I've gotten along those lines have been, the continuity of DC recently rebooted with the New 52. So,
oh yeah.
Yeah, we all know, or many of us probably know about the New 52. So a lot of the notes with respect to that related to, well, in this continuity, we have to be a little careful about saying this or this or that. So the nice thing about Swamp Thing is that because there are things like, we got to keep the Alan Moore run, for example, and make that part of the storyline that I was telling. So it's always sort of a little bit of both. But I didn't. One thing that was nice is they rarely ever said anything like, you can't do the scene. Like there's a bit where John Constantine goes to Scotland and where a tree. A devil-possessed tree has grown up that decants whiskey, so devil whiskey, and the whole town gets drunk on devil whiskey, and so basically like orgy, crazy, violent things are happening in the town, and Swamp Thing has to go save it. So that,
In Scotland.
In Scotland, yes.
How do you know?
Yes, right. So stuff like that, I never got a note. It was like, I think it was fine. I think there was one bit where there are two ladies making out a little bit too fervently. So it was like, let's see if we can pull back on the ladies making out a little, but they still made out in the final issue. So
I see.
yeah.
I want
You want me to send you that issue, Dan?
No. Yes, because it's a Charles Soule comic, and I run to read every Charles Soule comic.
Aw.
But no, I think what they're saying is right. Is that every editor is like their own company. Every editor is different, has a different flair and a different style. Some like to just choose the best teams they can and then stay back. Some like to be more hands-on. Some have to be. There's like a scene in Hamlet where. Oh, you see there. I don't mean to be all. No, but where Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are there, and they're trying to get information out of Hamlet. They're trying to get him to do things, and he gives him the speech about, "Do you think you can play me, like this kind of flute, or do you think you can?" And I find that the best editors are the ones who know how to play me, because I go through, like, if in a really stressful time and I have to get this thing and I'm stuck and I'm going slow, I go through these kind of stages, almost like Kubler-Ross, of like, everything I've ever written sucks, or I don't know what I'm doing. There are all these different. Hey, this is comics. It's fun. I have all these different stages of moods, and Tom Brevoort knows exactly which, do this for the Gipper speech to give me to get that script out. And sometimes it's the "I will fire you. You get this in," and sometimes it's the talking me off the ledge speech, and sometimes he knows which one to give me. And when I was working with Wacker on Spider-Man, he always gave me the wrong speech. So I'd be like on the ledge, and he'd be like giving me the speech, "And you're gonna get fired." "How are you fired?" Jump. Yeah.
Well, forget it. We'll get somebody else tomorrow.
Yeah. Somehow it all got done, but there was far more agita and angst.
They all talk about, I don't know if you ever heard those conversations. They all talk about us that way. Like, we all, how to manage us, and they all have different strategies.
How to
and
pet the fur just right.
Yeah, well, I mean, Ann, you were an editor for ages,
because I
right?
present both sides of it. I was the editor of all the X books, so I had all the mutant books, all the X books. And I had, Larry Hama, for instance, was one of my writers. And, he did Wolverine and he did some other stuff. And it was like, Larry just knew what he was doing, Do anybody know Larry Hama? I mean, there's G.I. Joe. And he's one of these sure-footed dudes. He turns a script in. I would be like, maybe change that word. Mary Jo Duffy writing Star Wars, she really knew her shit. She was doing a lot of the Jedi training school stuff, and, she came up with stuff that Lucasfilm used to say were the only people that said no, because they were like, maybe we want to do that in a movie, So we had, and then I had Chris Claremont, who was writing, the other half of my line. And because he was doing so many stories, we used to go out to lunch maybe 3 times a week and talk on the phone a lot, and it was basically, way too many ideas. So he would just roll with ideas, and I'd say, that's a good one, that's a good one. And then he'd go off and write them. So he needed a lot of help, front-end help, I think what you were talking about before. He needed a lot of front-end help in terms of let's, Ileana, who is she? We haven't done anything with. Let's send her to hell to see who she is. Let's see if Colossus will go get her and bring her back. Or, all these. And then we'd say, well, who haven't we played with yet? Cyclops is kind of boring, isn't he? Yeah, I think he's kind of, we'd come up with, especially with a team book, it's like singing in rounds. You can't always have it be a Wolverine story. You have to, let the other players do their turns. So there's a lot of that work with Chris. And the great thing is that then you just let him go. And then the panic set in, because it's okay, there's 4 books due and there's no scripts. And sure enough, he would always come in right under the wire with,
it's funny to hear it. I just reread a lot of the Claremont X-Men stuff, and the idea that ideas were cut out of that is wild to hear. That some of the densest stuff, even the amount of text on a page is crazy.
Oh my God.
It takes 3 times as long to read a Claremont issue.
But you don't mess with a winner, and our sales were going up, 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 and so even though I had pressure on me editorially to, do less stories, to do all that stuff, I was like, I ain't messing with this. Every issue goes up and up. The letters were amazing, and the fans were so passionate. I ain't going to be the one to say, hey, let's get a little more Alex Toth with this, It's so it ended up working out, I think.
Yeah, seems like it. All right, who else has a question? How about you?
comics seem to be more and more padded for trade these days. How do you find the right amount of story to keep, in each issue? With the shrinking number of pages,
I like how the revolt. I was like, can we get no. No, but we would. They told us we were gone from 22 to 20. I was like, no. And Mark Wade and I were sitting at a retreat. Like, can we get the 2 pages back? Can we get those? Because years after doing that, it's almost like a phantom limb.
Yeah.
You want those 2 frickin' pages.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I write creator-owned books too, and those are 22 still, most of them. And so it's weird now because my reflexes are all very much 20 now. So I feel like, all right, 2 more pages, I guess splashes, easy, But as far as padding for the trade, I don't know. I don't feel like that happens. I'm not doing that as much. I'm writing a lot of 1, 2, 3, 4 issue stories right now. So anyway,
Mike does basically trades.
Yeah, I funded most of my books through Kickstarter, and so I have a little more, I guess, sway. So I do 23-page issues. Just why not?
Luxury.
Yes, and but I do everything right to trade, but I don't. I mean, I plan it in 5-issue arcs, and it works out that way for me. I've never felt like I had to pad anything, so it's just the story goes where it goes, and I like to have an end point and then just build to it.
I have a question for you. Do you work with the wrestlers at all, or?
Yeah, all the art in my book is done by wrestlers.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Jerry Lawler paints the covers. The interiors are done by a wrestler from New Zealand. I have a bunch of famous wrestlers that do short stories, and the ones that have art skills contribute art to it. Yeah, I've had like 13 televised wrestlers that contributed to the book. So it's about a kid trying to find the art form of wrestling. So using wrestlers as artists sort of advances the theme.
why did you choose the Norman Rockwell cover idea, which is very cool?
Jerry's a big Norman Rockwell fan, and I live close to the museum, so whenever he's in town for WWE, we go to the Norman Rockwell Museum. It's the one place that he doesn't really get recognized, and so I wanted to give him something that he would really sink his teeth into, and I've always been a huge Norman Rockwell fan, so I felt like that would be the ideal way to...
Are you a wrestler?
No.
As the person who's kind of like editing the book, how do you crack the whip on a guy who's a professional wrestler who's not turning his pages in on time?
Well, that's the hardest thing is that, I mean, he's so busy, and all of them are so busy. So, I mean, I do my story, and then there's backup stories written by wrestlers, so there's 3 creative teams on that. I'm writing my own book, and then the intro to that was written by Judah Freelander, who's on 30 Rock. So trying to trace down like 13 different people who are, you know, televised and have better things to do than do what they're doing for me is a chore in and of itself. Yeah, the wrestlers who love comics love the book. I mean, that's why they all agreed to help. Jill Thompson's a big wrestling fan, so she did the credits pages, and you know, it's resonated very well. There's been a history of really awful wrestling comics, so you know, I wanted to write a wrestling.
I edited one.
Oh yeah.
I thought it was really good. It was Ron Wilson's Super Pro. Super Boxers. Super Boxers.
Well, it's boxers, not wrestling.
Oops. Well, there you go. Yeah.
But you know, they've all been like sort of licensed cash grabs, and as a wrestling fan, none of them ever appealed to me, and that was why I decided, you know, and then reading Concrete and you know realizing that you know you could do something educational, and you know I wanted to sort of let people see wrestling through my eyes as an art form, and you know, so you sort of learn the craft of wrestling through the eyes of the main character as he's starting from like day one, but like navigating the underbelly of the business.
My first indie comic that I ever had published was a wrestling book, actually. It's called Strong Man. It was about lucha libre stuff. So
that's awesome. I had no idea.
Yeah. So there you go. I mean, wrestling is where people get started.
Well, I also like that whole documentary approach to like where you're actually getting the real stories from the real wrestlers.
And they're very personal. Like Shane Helms, the Hurricane, did a backup story, and he was literally sitting in the doctor's office waiting for an MRI on his neck, not knowing if his career was going to be over, and we were working out the details of the story, and it's a very sort of personal thing, you know, and it's one of the more powerful bits in the book, I think, so.
Sounds great.
And you and the horses?
To some extent, though, I think the trade paperback, doing 5 issues for the trade paperback, has, in some ways, hurt the field in that nobody knows how to write short stories anymore. You know, Will Eisner, who I mentioned earlier, was, of course, obviously the master of the 7 and later 8-page short story. But nowadays, it's almost, I say almost, easy to write a 5-part story because you just sort of put more stuff in there and more fight scenes if you run out of them or that type of thing. But an 8-page story or a 5-page story even is something very, very different, and there has to be there's no padding in that. And to some extent, I think that's a lost skill, which is a shame.
I love writing short stories. Love it.
Great.
All right.
I've got kind of a sort of a facetious question. You know, nowadays, most of the comics I read are the image ones. You know, I don't get too much into DC or Marvel example because it seems like all your main characters, they've just been through so much already. And there's so many different backstories, and when something comes up that no one likes, they just hit the reset button, and everything goes back again. So for the folks who've really been around for a while, I mean, do you ever just want to kill Batman? I mean, at a certain point, do you ever get tired of saying, oh, I need a new baddie for Spider-Man? Oh, we defeated Galactus, now we got to find the new Galactus. Like, how do you guys keep it fresh in your head to keep...
That's an excellent writing craft question. I think that's really good. Why don't, go ahead.
You answer.
Me? Well, all right. Let's talk Swamp Thing again, right? So Swamp Thing, it was... Okay, so how do these characters keep cycling around, and how do we actually try to do new things with them that feel impactful?
5 years.
Yeah, of some of the great classic. Every story you write is really being held up against some of the best writers and creators of the medium. So when I took the Swamp Thing gig, I took it over from Scott Snyder, who many of us probably know is the current Batman writer, very, very famous in the business and very, very good. He's very skilled. Previously on Swamp Thing, you know, you had Len Wein made him up. You had Alan Moore kind of bringing him into sort of the mainstream in a big way. But then you also had guys like Rick Veitch. Brian K. Vaughan wrote on him. Josh Dysart wrote on him. Grant Morrison, Mark Millar. Like it's a real rogues gallery of incredible writers on Swamp Thing. So when I took him over, it was like I'm really, and this was my first big 2 gig, my first gig at Marvel or DC. So I'm thinking, you know, should I do this? Because if whatever. But I decided to do it. I figured I would swing for the fences as hard as I could, because what else can you or should you do? So I started writing and I started thinking about it, and you know, ultimately it's. I thought, first of all, that the percentage of people who had read all of those old writers and were now going to be reading mine is probably going to be pretty small. I think every generation is dealing with a new set of comic book writers, not totally, or readers, not totally, but at least to some degree. So I thought, as long as I can make every issue and the moments that he experiences feel real, whether they're big or small, it doesn't really matter if people have had great moments with that character before, because if you like the character enough, then you're going to resonate with his joy and his sorrow and his pain. So I think really it's not about the villains, and it's not about the good guys or the bad guys necessarily. It's about making it relatable and for the time in which it's being written. So that's how I approached it, and you know, hopefully it worked. But
I hear what you're saying, because I'm a guy. I killed Peter Parker for 1.5 years and replaced and put Doc Ock's brain in his head, and people went, "Well, what are you doing?" And it was knocking people off their pins that got people to look at the book again. But there were characters like I'd gone on record and I'd done funny jokes on podcasts and things, and I did it way too many times, making fun of the Vulture, saying I was never going to do a Vulture story because, you know, Spider-Man was fighting him when he was an old man, when Spider-Man was a sophomore in high school, and now that he's well out of college and has a career, it's like punching Orville Redenbacher. You know, it's like, hey, Grandpa, bam! And I used to feel bad for the Vulture, and I used to do all these jokes about the Vulture. And Brevoort said to me, I am ordering you to write a Vulture story. You've been making these jokes for years about the Vulture. I've never seen you write. You write a good Vulture story. You look at the Vulture, and someone throwing down the gauntlet like that made me go, okay. And then now I can't get enough of writing the Vulture. We rethought about him like, well, his powers are gravity based. Well, he could pick up a whole water tower and throw it at you. You know, because it's the same thing that's making him fly. Or you are an old man. What if I remade him Fagin, where he started giving out the Vulture technology to little kids, and they were going off and stealing, and he'd get his take sitting in his nest. And I'm like, every time I kept coming more ideas. Who hasn't done this with the Vulture? Is it just because it's been around for 50 or 75 years doesn't mean you can't find that new thing. And when you do, then hey, you know, imagine if Frank Miller thought that about Daredevil. or Walt Simonson about Thor, or these guys go in and they just put in a stamp and then they run with it. It can be done. The fun thing about a book like a Saga or a Walking Dead, or you get to create that world. So that gives you a leg up in a weird way. You know, we have to look at these guys that have been used a million times in movies and TV shows and this, and find our own voice for it and to go forward. And if we don't, there's 12 guys in line who want that gig. You know, someone said to me like, "Oh, don't you want to do more? You know, do stuff for Image or do stuff for that?" And I'm like, "Dude, I had Spider-Man on my lunchbox and on my pajamas. I want Spider-Man. I want to write Spider-Man. Screw you. You know, do your own, create your own thing. That makes you happy. But goddamn, I want to write Spider-Man." So yeah.
I've written a lot of Batman stories, and Batman, of course, been around 6 years this year. Last year was his 75th anniversary, and I found very early that not so much Bob Kane, but Bill Finger established a recipe, let's put it that way, for the Batman stories. I don't like the term formula because a formula is something you can't deviate from without failing. But a recipe, you can play around with a recipe. You can use walnuts instead of peanuts or whatever, and try it out. So I found that with Batman, you can. My goal was to do the same kind of stories that gave me a lot of fun when I was a kid, but to do them in the modern scope of Batman. Batman, there is a little more possibly psychologically realistic, and you have to bring a little bit of that in. But I think still you can have a lot of fun with Batman and Robin, figuring out what the Joker's latest case is and how you can stop him from poisoning the water supply.
I remember reading your run and loving it, and like there's a character, the Scarecrow, and I always go, how many stories can you do with the Scarecrow? And he wrote a story I'd never read with the Scarecrow before, where the Scarecrow was taking away people's fear and making them completely fearless. I'd never seen anyone do that before, and it was the coolest Scarecrow story of all time.
Oh, well, thank you. That's the way that I guess my mind works as a plotter, is to take the fundamentals of a character and say, how can we play around with this, still remaining true to what the character has been established as, and yet jogging around some and get something that no one's ever done.
Could you talk a little bit more about Bill Finger?
Well, I don't know that much about Bill Finger. I never met him, unfortunately. I just am aware that I think of all the injustices that have been done to comic creators throughout the history of comics. I think Bill Finger is unfortunately #1 on that list. Bill Finger basically at least co-created the entire universe that we know of as Batman, and never ever in his lifetime made a dime beyond page rate. Never made any reprint, never made any royalties, never got any money from DC for the licensing of Batman.
He did write the Clock King episode on the show, though.
Yeah, that's true. He did co-write the Clock King episode of the Batman TV show, which is cool because he's like the only Batman writer who actually worked on the TV show, which is swell. But unfortunately, there's all you can do now is talk about Bill Finger and try to get his name on the product, which I don't think will ever happen.
Well, they just did it for Kirby. I mean, it's not,
Well, that's true. That's true. And I think I don't want to turn this necessarily into a company issue, because there are a lot of people up at DC who I believe have a lot of sympathy toward Bill Finger's viewpoint and would put his name on Batman if they could. But there are people above them who are saying, "Why? It's just, he's dead. He can't benefit from it. Why mess with it? Why make waves?"
I think we probably have time for one, maybe two more. All right, you've been waiting.
Yeah, just a question for the writers. What are your favorite current stories covering trends? I know they've done away with the top bubble. Now it seems like they're doing away with the Eric Fox. Kind of Grant Morrison did away with those at one point. But as writers, what
I think did everyone hear that question? It was kind of the trends of. I mean, when I was first in comics, I really loved thought bubbles because you really was a way to get into someone's head. And then when I came back to comics after leaving for a while, my editors were like, "What are you doing these thought bubbles for? It's like cool and slick to put it in a caption." But for me, the problem was the caption was still a little bit too omnipotent for me. It was like your brain's kind of overmined, whereas the thought balloon had a lot more intimacy to it. So you might be thinking these higher thoughts about, like, your life and that what you have to do in a caption. But in the thought balloons, you know, you could get a little more intimate and a little even more like, you know, I forgot milk or whatever. You know, you don't put that in a caption. So I felt like by making this rule that you couldn't have a thought balloon, and my editor was basically like, you just can't do it, I thought we just lost one of the tools in our repertoire. And yeah, I know thought balloons look dorky, but you know, with the right artist, you could bring them back and have them be cool. I miss them.
I've seen some come back that like they're doing new things with thought balloons, like different ways of doing it. I see them a lot on actually in a lot of X-Men books. Like Brian Bendis is doing a lot of his X-Men run uses them as the way telepaths talk to each other, and it's very it's sort of they look different. They kind of have a different lettering style to them, but they they work. They're not like they were with the little.
I still use the boop, 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 whenever I want. Brevoort just lets me do it, and get off my yard.
All right, but it was storytelling trends, I guess, is what we're talking about. So, what else, Dan? Have you any other storytelling trends that you've been seeing, or Ann, or either one?
The other thing that I've noticed, and that some of the fans have come up to me, and they've been very. They like that Marvel does the recap page and wonders why DC doesn't do it, and that's a big thing. Marvel in the old days, like when I was writing Daredevil, there'd always be a caption, you know, young Matt Murdock hit by an isotope, you know, but he got these bigger powers. So it was like wallpaper to most people. They all knew that caption. It was invisible. They just didn't even read it. But if you were a new reader, you'd get the gist of it. And now Marvel's doing this whole, you know, so it gets you up to speed, and DC isn't. So even though we try really hard to open a comic with some kind of natural recap, it's not that easy to do both a natural recap and then have that not be annoying when it's collected into a trade and you're essentially getting like repetition. So I don't know who's making these decisions, but maybe we'll talk about that.
On I just did 2 big crossovers at DC, Doomed, which was sort of retelling of the Doomsday thing, but 10 times as good, and a big Green Lantern event, and those we did recap pages because since they crossed a whole bunch of different titles, and people may not be reading Red Lanterns, but who were reading Green Lanterns or whatever. So the idea was to, if you were only reading one, you'd be able to catch up. So, and it seemed like it worked. Fans liked it. So maybe, who knows? Maybe it might be shifting back towards it at DC anyway. I don't know.
I want to do away with full-page splash establishing shots of buildings. That drives me crazy. I look at that and I start calculating like how many cents that is and how much if you're $3.99, and I go, that's a panel. I hate that. I so hate that. How many times have you opened up like a book and there's a double-page spread of the helicarrier? It's the freaking helicarrier. I know what it looks like. Just a little panel, but it's so big. But I just wrote my first ever story with Galactus in it for Silver Surfer, and so I keep putting in splash pages and keep cutting out panels because he better look big when you see him. That's true. Yeah.
I tried to do a little innovative storytelling with this new comic I'm doing called Horsepower G, aimed at all ages. And what it is, it's adventure with kids and horses. And what I do is I tell the story from the kids' perspective going forward. But if you turn it over and read it like manga, it's from the horse's perspective. So instead of like thought balloons, it's like the horses are speaking to each other, and it meets in the middle. So something different.
Do they turn against us at the end?
They rule the world, yes. Like Planet of the Apes, the planet of the horses.
Throw girl or girl conquers horse?
Well, the girl and the horse love each other, and that their love is what brings in the superpower. It's a mare. In case you're worried.
Every third issue, there's just the issue where the horse goes, carrots, 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 carrots.
All right, I think that's the time pretty much, yeah? All right, maybe last question?
Yes, I'm always been a biggest fan of the comic industry, especially Marvel, but I have nothing against DC. My question pertains to what is it that inspires y'all to be comic writers? And what advice would you give to any future comic writers or somebody that want to work in the comic industry?
Learn penciling. We have enough writers. I don't want any competition. Practice art. So, no.
You know what I think? Ultimately, we started out at the beginning. We're all fans, and one of the things that I think was really cool was the first Thursday night I was here. I was sitting at the bar, and I was sitting next to Dan and Ann, and they didn't know me at the time. And Dan was talking about his Silver Surfer arc, and you could see how excited he was. And I think that's really cool. You know, you're in a business like that.
He got excited about empanadas yesterday. I mean, he gets excited about anything.
Empanadas are no joke.
Have you seen the new iPhone? It's awesome.
Yeah.
But I think that's cool. You know, I mean, he's done a lot of stuff, but he's still very excited about his work. And I mean, obviously, I write about something that I'm very passionate about. I think that's what, I think that people can see that in this day and age. I think people know when they're being sold to and when you're trying to sell them action figures. And I think that people know when your story's coming from a place of passion, because I think that's, that connects with people. So that's my advice.
I also think that you just do the work. Like, there are people that'll say, write from life, or people that say, screw that, write about space. But really, just start thinking about the kind of stories you want to tell, and then just start writing. Just start doing the work and start making the little grids and figuring out how many panels on a page, and just start making comics.
Write what you want to read.
Yeah, write what you want to read. That's a good one.
And read what you want to write, too. I think reading's a huge part of it. So, all right. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. We'll see you again.